There comes a moment that doesn't look dramatic, doesn't sound heroic, it's just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud your life has been. You stop scrolling, stop replying, stop explaining, and somewhere in that stillness, something inside you exhales. It's not peace yet, it's the absence of pretending. The world doesn't go silent. It's just that the noise no longer owns you. You've spent years drowning in voices that sound like yours, but aren't expectations, opinions, the constant hum of needing to prove you're fine. It becomes normal to run on autopilot, to keep saying yes even when your soul means no. You fill your days with movement so you don't have to feel the stillness of being lost. But silence has a way of finding you, not as punishment, but as invitation. When the noise fades, it doesn't feel freeing at first. It feels like grief, because beneath the distraction was emptiness, and facing that emptiness is terrifying. You realize how much of your identity was built on motion, how being busy felt like being valuable. But now, standing in the quiet, there's nothing to hide behind. You begin to see that the chaos you called life wasn't living, it was survival disguised as purpose. In this stillness, you begin to meet yourself again, not the version that pleases, not the one that performs, but the one that watches. The observer within you, the soul that has always been waiting beneath the noise. You notice how heavy your days have felt, how shallow your breathing has become. You begin to feel everything. You postpone the sadness, the confusion, the ache of unspoken truth. And it hurts, but that hurt is sacred because it means your heart is thawing. The world teaches us that silence is absence, but it's actually presence, raw and unfiltered. It's where life whispers what chaos keeps you too distracted to hear. When you finally stop filling every gap with sound, the truth emerges. Like an echo. It tells you what you've ignored. It tells you what you've buried. It reminds you of the person you promised to become before you learn to settle. At first, you'll want to run from this quiet. You'll reach for your phone, your work, your people, anything to not sit with yourself. But running from silence is running from healing. Because silence is the language of self-recognition. It's how you hear what your heart has been trying to say beneath all the doing. There's something wild about realizing that peace doesn't arrive with thunder, it arrives with surrender. You start to understand that life isn't asking you to add more. It's asking you to pause, to feel the space between breaths, to trust that what's falling away was never yours to keep. The noise isn't ending, it's evolving into clarity. You start to feel your soul return in fragments through slow mornings, through moments that ask for nothing from you. You begin to understand that the quiet doesn't erase you. It reintroduces you, the real you, the one who isn't trying to win time, approval, or applause, the one who just is. Finding yourself doesn't look like a grand revelation. It looks like realizing you no longer crave what kept you small. It looks like unclenching. It looks like breathing fully for the first time in years. You begin to see that peace isn't passive, it's brave. It takes courage to listen when the world screams, "Move faster." It takes strength to pause when everyone else is racing. But in this quiet rebellion, something profound happens. You stop performing and start existing. The silence doesn't ask you to be perfect, it asks you to be honest, to admit you're tired, to confess you miss yourself, to acknowledge that beneath all your roles, there's still a human being who just wants to come home. And maybe that's what this part of your life is really about. Not success, not control, not noise, but the soft, sacred art of listening again. Listening to your breath, to your thoughts, to your truth. Because that's where the real return begins, not in what you achieve, but in what you finally allow yourself to feel. The quiet isn't empty. It's full of everything you've been avoiding. And if you can stay here long enough in this fragile peace, you'll realize something extraordinary. You were never lost. You were just too loud to hear yourself coming back. Some parts of you didn't leave, they simply stopped waiting to be chosen. There are versions of you scattered across time, versions that once carried fire, laughter, and hope. You don't see them at first. They live quietly in the corners of your memory, in the way you used to dream without fear, in the way you used to smile without overthinking. They're not gone. They're just waiting for you to stop surviving long enough to remember them. We rarely notice when we abandon ourselves. It happens slowly, a compromise here, a silence there. We trade honesty for peace, passion for acceptance, freedom for stability. Each trade feels small, almost harmless. But over time, those small surrenders build into something heavy, the quiet weight of becoming unrecognizable to yourself. You tell yourself you've grown, and maybe you have, but sometimes growth disguises itself as loss. You start avoiding the things that once lit you up because they remind you of how fearless you used to be. You stop writing, stop dancing, stop saying what you mean. You start moving in ways that fit other people's comfort zones. You learn to shrink beautifully, smiling as you disappear. But here's the truth. Those old versions of you didn't die out of weakness. They stepped aside because they couldn't thrive in the noise you kept choosing. They didn't leave because they stopped loving you. They left because you stopped listening. If you're quiet enough, you can still feel them. The teenager who believed anything was possible. The friend who loved too deeply. The dreamer who used to wake up excited. They visit you in random waves, in a song you forgot you loved, in a photo you can't throw away, in the mirror when you're too tired to fake strength. You don't need to resurrect them, you just need to thank them. They were never failures. They were chapters that carried you across storms you didn't know how to survive. Every version of you, even the ones you're ashamed of, was trying to protect something pure. You might think you've lost too many pieces to feel whole again, but maybe wholeness was never about keeping everything intact. Maybe it's about honoring every piece that brought you here. The bold, the broken, the naive, the strong. They all stitch together the person you're becoming now. It's strange how grief hides in transformation. We talk about healing as light, but before light comes mourning, not for others, but for the selves that didn't make it with you. You'll cry over who you used to be. You'll ache for the dreams you had to bury. You'll feel the weight of every version that had to fall apart so you could grow roots instead of wings. This isn't weakness, it's reverence, because it means you're paying attention again. You're acknowledging that you're not just starting over, you're standing on the bones of every self that fought to get you here. Maybe that's what becoming really is, not rebirth, but remembrance. Remembering the courage of the person who tried, even when they failed. Remembering the softness of the one who loved, even when it hurt. Remembering the silence of the one who stayed, even when they should have left. You don't owe those versions perfection. You owe them peace. You owe them gratitude. You owe them the chance to rest, knowing their sacrifices weren't wasted. Because without them, there wouldn't be a you left to find. So let yourself feel the grief. Let it wash through you without resistance. Sit with the ache of all the people you've been. Cry for the one who kept everything together. Smile for the one who believed in impossible things. Whisper thank you to the one who kept going when you wanted to give up. Then stand, because this is where your evolution begins, not in forgetting who you were, but in forgiving who you had to be. The truth is, you don't really lose yourself, you just outgrow old containers. You move from versions that once fit to spaces that now require more of you. The past selves you mourn are not gone. They are imprinted in your being, shaping the language of your becoming. You are every version that ever lived, every moment that broke you, every spark that rebuilt you. You don't erase them to move forward, you carry them. You let their voices become your foundation. You build not from scratch, but from memory. And maybe one day, when life feels whole again, you'll look back and realize those versions of you never died. They simply transformed into the strength that now lets you breathe easier, love deeper, and stand taller. They didn't vanish. They became your roots. The path doesn't appear when you plan it. It appears when you start walking. We spend most of our lives waiting for clarity, for signs, for certainty, for the perfect alignment of timing and courage. We tell ourselves, when I know what to do, I'll move. But life doesn't work that way. Clarity isn't the reward of waiting, it's the result of motion. The map never comes first. The first step is the map. It's terrifying, isn't it? To walk without knowing where you're going, to move without guarantees. You want a plan, a direction, something to hold. But all you get is a faint pull, a whisper that says, go anyway. The fear in your chest argues. The mind lists every reason to wait, but the soul knows waiting won't save you. Movement will. You've been here before, at crossroads that never announced themselves. The decisions that shaped your life were rarely the ones you felt ready for. You just moved. You just said yes to the unknown. And somehow, the road rose up to meet you. That's how growth works, not in grand revelations, but in small, trembling steps that carry faith disguised as curiosity. When you begin walking without a map, you realize how much of life was built on the illusion of control. You thought you needed to predict outcomes, but what you really needed was trust. You thought you had to plan the whole journey, but the truth is, you only ever needed the courage to start. Some days, the road will feel endless. You'll question if you're going the right way. You'll look around and see others moving faster, surer, seemingly certain, and in comparison, your pace will feel like failure. But you must remember, growth doesn't move in straight lines. Some lessons arrive only when you're lost enough to see differently. There's something holy about uncertainty. It humbles you. It strips away your false confidence and forces you to pay attention. You start noticing things you once rushed past, the way light hits the ground, the rhythm of your breath, the stillness in pauses. You begin to realize that not knowing is not weakness. It's wisdom in disguise. It means you've outgrown pretending. Walking without a map teaches surrender, not the passive kind, but the courageous kind. The kind that says, I trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense. You stop demanding answers and start listening to instincts. You learn that mistakes are not detours, they are part of the design. Every misstep, every delay, every closed door is shaping your direction in ways logic never could. And somewhere along this uncertain road, something beautiful happens, the fear quiets. The tension in your shoulders softens. You begin to feel guided, not by what you know, but by what you feel. You start hearing life speak to you through intuition and timing, in coincidences, in people who show up exactly when you need them. The more you walk, the clearer it becomes. The path was never hidden. It was just waiting for your presence. There's no straight line to becoming yourself. There are circles, pauses, regressions, leaps. You'll think you're lost, only to find out you've been walking toward yourself all along. You'll realize that maybe the reason the map never appeared is because you are the map. The directions were always inside you, they just needed silence to be read. So, let this be your lesson in faith. Not everything needs to be understood before it's lived. The most important roads, healing, purpose, self-love, are built as you walk them. You cannot think your way into clarity. You can only move your way into it. Keep walking, even when it feels uncertain. Keep walking, even when you can't see the next step, because the road doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for participation. Every breath, every stumble, every heartbeat that chooses to keep going is an act of trust. One day, you'll look back and realize every detour was divine. Every delay was protection. Every wrong turn led you closer to something true. You'll see that the road wasn't testing you. It was teaching you how to walk by faith, not by sight. So keep going. Don't wait for the map. Don't wait for the moment you feel ready. The map appears to those who move, and right now, this step, this uncertain, trembling, beautiful step is exactly where you're supposed to be. You thought peace was the prize, but sometimes peace is the protest. The world taught you to rush, to chase, to prove. Every moment had to mean something. Every silence had to be filled. Every breath had to be productive. You learned to measure your worth by how much you could carry without collapsing. You called exhaustion purpose. You called burnout progress. But somewhere deep down, something inside you started whispering, there has to be another way. That whisper was the beginning of rebellion. Not the loud kind, not the kind that fights with the world, but the kind that refuses to keep betraying yourself for its approval. The kind that slows down in a culture that glorifies speed. Slowing down isn't about doing less, it's about doing what's real. It's about remembering that life isn't meant to feel like an emergency. It's looking around and realizing you've been sprinting through days that were meant to be lived, not conquered. You were so busy chasing moments that you forgot to inhabit them. When you slow down, it feels unnatural at first. Your body doesn't know how to rest without guilt. Stillness feels like failure. You catch yourself checking the clock, waiting for permission to breathe. But that discomfort, that unease, is the withdrawal of a pace that was never meant for your soul. The truth is, slowing down is terrifying because it exposes everything you've been outrunning. The doubts, the grief, the buried questions. You start to hear the echoes you silenced with busyness. You begin to notice how much of your drive was actually fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of being forgotten, fear of confronting yourself. But slowing down isn't laziness, it's liberation. It's saying, I refuse to perform being alive when I can actually live. There is a kind of power in softness that the world underestimates. When you slow down, you start noticing the world again, not as a checklist, but as a feeling. The sky looks wider, music sounds heavier, conversations start meaning something again. You begin to realize how much beauty you've been stepping over because you were always in a hurry to get somewhere else. The rebellion is in choosing presence over productivity, in pausing long enough to taste your food, to watch the rain without picking up your phone, to listen without planning a reply. It's in no longer trying to keep up with people who are running toward emptiness. It's in honoring your pace even when the world calls it slow. Sometimes slowing down is how you find what was missing because in stillness, truth has room to speak. You start to understand that peace isn't passive. It's an act of resistance in a world addicted to noise. Every time you choose calm over chaos, you're rewriting your story. You're teaching your nervous system that safety doesn't come from control, it comes from trust. You begin to see that life has its own rhythm, and it's softer than the one you were taught. Flowers don't rush to bloom, rivers don't compete to reach the sea. Dawn never apologizes for being slow. Everything unfolds at its own pace, and so do you. When you slow down, time changes shape. You stop chasing minutes and start inhabiting them. You start realizing that the moments you thought were wasted were actually the ones that mattered most. The quiet mornings, the gentle laughs, the pauses between words. That's where living hides, not in what you're chasing, but in what you finally stop running from. The most radical thing you can do in a world that profits from your distraction is to be fully here, to walk slower, to breathe deeper, to love without multitasking it, to rest without earning it. You don't need to justify stillness. You just need to remember that life happens in the space between tasks. So let this be your rebellion, not against the world, but against the version of you that believed chaos was the only way to feel alive. Let this be the chapter where you relearn softness, where you discover that slowing down doesn't make life smaller, it makes it sacred. Because in slowing down, you don't lose momentum, you gain meaning. You don't fall behind, you fall back into yourself. And maybe that's the real revolution, not running faster, but finally being still enough to arrive. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to fix yourself and start learning to see yourself. For most of your life, you've been at war with your reflection. You've picked yourself apart in mirrors, in memories, in moments that no one else even noticed. You've rewritten your story 1,000 times, each draft more apologetic than the last. You learned to call it self-improvement, but deep down, it was self-rejection wearing a noble disguise. You convinced yourself that you'd finally deserve peace once you became better, prettier, calmer, smarter, more successful. But peace was never waiting on perfection. It was waiting on permission. The permission to be seen exactly as you are, without explanation or edit. It takes courage to look at yourself with softness after years of scrutiny, to meet your flaws and not flinch, to notice your tiredness and not shame it, to see your scars not as proof of damage but as evidence of survival. That's what it means to see yourself again, not as a project, but as a person. You've spent so long dissecting your worth that you forgot how to simply witness it. Every time you compared your journey to someone else's, you erased a part of your own beauty. Every time you punished yourself for not being further along, you silenced the truth that healing isn't linear. Growth doesn't happen on schedule. It happens in seasons, quiet, unpredictable, sometimes invisible. When you start seeing yourself with softer eyes, you realize that nothing about you was ever broken, only misunderstood. The parts you called too much were just love that had nowhere safe to land. The parts you called lazy were exhaustion misnamed by guilt. The parts you called cold were boundaries finally learning how to stand. You begin to recognize that self-acceptance isn't a single moment of clarity. It's a practice. It's learning to offer yourself the same gentleness you give everyone else. It's allowing your reflection to be human, messy, changing, uncertain, and loving it anyway. Sometimes that means forgiving yourself for the things you didn't know back then, for the choices you made from fear, for the silence you mistook for strength. You don't need to justify the roads you took when you didn't know there were others. You only need to acknowledge that you kept walking, that you're still here. That's grace. Seeing yourself softly doesn't mean denying your pain. It means holding it differently. It means looking at your past selves not with blame, but with gratitude. Because every version of you, the naive, the impulsive, the wounded, the hopeful, was doing their best with what they had. They weren't mistakes. They were messengers. They led you here. As your vision clears, you start to notice beauty in places you used to overlook. The faint laugh lines near your eyes, the resilience in your posture, the way your voice trembles but still speaks truth. You start appreciating the ordinary miracles that have carried you through your heartbeat, your breath, your persistence. You realize that maybe self-love isn't loud or perfect. Maybe it's just quiet recognition, a gentle thank you whispered to yourself after years of silence. And something shifts. The critic in your mind starts losing power. The noise that once dictated your worth begins to fade. You start making choices that feel kind instead of correct. You begin showing up as someone who no longer needs to earn their own approval. This softness changes everything. You stop rushing healing. You stop demanding closure. You stop needing to be fixed before you can be loved. Because now, you understand love isn't a reward for perfection. It's the soil in which you grow. Seeing yourself with softer eyes doesn't mean life stops hurting. It means pain no longer defines you. It means you can feel deeply without drowning. It means you can fail without losing faith in your worth. There's power in gentle vision because what you choose to see, you begin to become. When you start looking at yourself like someone worth saving, something inside you believes it. Slowly, quietly, you start acting like it. You speak with more kindness. You move with more care. You give yourself the time to bloom without rushing the season. And one day, without realizing it, you look in the mirror and see not a battle, but a home. You see someone who made it through every storm and still found a way to love the rain. That's not weakness, that's becoming. That's not surrender, that's peace. And it all began the day you chose to see yourself clearly and finally decided that was enough. There's a sacred stillness between endings and beginnings, the space where the old you exhales and the new you hasn't yet learned to breathe. No one prepares you for the in-between, that strange, suspended space where you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. It's quiet there, almost painfully quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the pause between heartbeats. You're not broken, but you don't feel whole either. You're rebuilding, but the blueprint has vanished. This is the silence people rarely talk about, the part of healing that doesn't look beautiful. There are no victories to post, no milestones to celebrate, just the dull ache of uncertainty and the whispering question that repeats in your chest, who am I now? You try to fill the space at first. You distract yourself with noise, with plans, with people, but eventually you realize that nothing echoes louder than what's unresolved inside you. That's when you start to understand silence isn't emptiness, it's invitation. It's the universe saying, wait, listen, something is trying to be born here. In this stillness, everything you once believed starts to dissolve. Old stories lose their weight. Identities you outgrew fall away. It's uncomfortable, like standing in a room that used to feel like home but now feels too small. Yet this discomfort is sacred. It means you're expanding. You begin to see how much of your past self was built around survival, the defenses, the roles, the constant need to be okay. You wore those layers like armor, and they served their purpose. But now, in this silence, you can finally lay them down, because survival is no longer the goal, living is. The silence tests you, it stretches your patience, it tempts you to rush your becoming. But transformation isn't something you can force. It's something you surrender to. Like seeds in the dark, your growth is happening where no one can see it. Trust that. Some days, you'll feel lost, not because you've failed, but because you're being rerouted. Life is stripping away what no longer serves your truth, and that loss feels like grief. You'll mourn versions of yourself you once loved, the dreamer, the fighter, the believer. You'll miss the certainty of who you used to be. But grief is proof that you're evolving. It's the bridge between what was and what will be. In that quiet, you start noticing subtler things, the way light hits your hands in the morning, the rhythm of your breath, the texture of your thoughts when you stop editing them. You start realizing how much of life you missed while you were rushing to become. Now, you're simply being. And in that being, you find something more enduring than happiness, peace. Peace doesn't always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like nothing, like a blank page. That's because you're being rewritten. The silence isn't absence. It's space being made for who you're meant to be. Every pause, every uncertainty, every moment of stillness is rearranging you at the cellular level. You learn that this phase, this quiet interval, is not a detour. It's the heart of transformation. The stillness isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's life resetting your rhythm so that when you move again, you move with intention. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence begins to hum. You feel ideas returning, light returning, a sense of direction forming from the fog. It doesn't arrive like thunder. It rises like dawn, soft, gradual, inevitable. You don't even realize it at first, but the version of you that entered this silence is not the same one who's leaving it. You start to see that every pause was purposeful, every slow breath was sacred. You were not lost, you were gestating, you were not stuck, you were becoming. So if you find yourself here between who you were and who you're becoming, don't rush through it. Sit with it. Listen, because this silence, uncomfortable as it is where truth returns to you. You are not behind. You are not late. You are exactly where transformation whispers your name. And one day, you'll look back and realize that the quietest chapter was the one that rebuilt your voice. Because the silence between versions isn't a void, it's the sound of your soul, remembering who it was always meant to be. You were never meant to chase wholeness, you were meant to remember it. You spend half your life thinking becoming is a climb, that there's some summit where everything finally makes sense, where the noise quiets, where you arrive perfectly composed and complete. But the truth is softer than that. Becoming was never about getting somewhere new. It was about finding your way back to what's been quietly waiting inside you all along. You see, life doesn't sculpt you into someone else. It strips away what was never you. Every heartbreak, every failure, every goodbye, it's all chiseling. Not to change your shape, but to reveal your essence. You don't become by adding layers. You become by shedding the ones that kept you from seeing yourself clearly. Somewhere along this journey, you realize you were never broken. You were buried beneath expectations, noise, and other people's versions of who you should be. And every time you healed, every time you forgave, every time you chose peace over performance, you were unearthing the real you, slowly, tenderly, without even realizing it. The beauty of finding yourself again is that it doesn't come with fanfare. There's no announcement, no fireworks, no sudden clarity. It's subtle, like waking up one morning and realizing you're breathing easier. The weight you used to carry doesn't feel as heavy. The places you used to force yourself to fit no longer call your name. The silence that once scared you now feels like home. That's how you know you've returned. Not because life got simpler, but because your relationship with it changed. You stopped trying to control the story and started trusting its unfolding. You stopped demanding certainty and started dancing with mystery. You stopped needing to arrive and started belonging right where you are. Becoming isn't a finish line, it's a rhythm. It's the way your heart expands after every fall. It's the way you keep choosing softness in a world that teaches hardness. It's every time you say no without guilt, yes without fear, and I'm still learning without shame. That's growth, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that hums beneath your skin. There's a quiet power in knowing that you don't have to chase purpose, you can live it. You don't have to prove worth, you can embody it. You don't have to predict the future, you can trust yourself to meet it when it comes. That's the real peace, not in knowing what's ahead, but in knowing who you'll be when it arrives. Sometimes you'll slip, you'll forget the lessons, you'll question the journey, but that's okay. Returning to yourself isn't a one-time event, it's a lifelong conversation. You will lose and find yourself 100 times in love, in loss, in silence, in laughter, and every return will feel different, deeper, fuller, truer. This is the grace of being human, to be unfinished and still worthy, to be uncertain and still growing, to be imperfect and still enough. You don't need to rush toward completion, you just need to remain open to the becoming. And one day, when you least expect it, you'll realize the version of you that used to survive is now the one that thrives. The one that used to chase is now the one that trusts. The one that used to beg for belonging is now the one who creates it simply by being. You won't need grand answers. You won't need validation. You'll just breathe deeply, knowing that you made it not to a destination, but to yourself. That's what this part is, not the ending, not the beginning, but the remembering. The quiet return to your center. The realization that you never really lost yourself. You just stopped listening long enough to hear where your soul was waiting. Becoming isn't about becoming new. It's about coming home again and again to the place inside you that has always known peace, even when the world forgot to remind you of it. So when the world rushes you, slow down. When doubt tells you you're behind, smile gently. You are not lost. You are not late. You are simply arriving in your own time, in your own way, in your own truth. Because this right here, right now, this is the part where you find yourself again.